This is the, I'm hoping, last video for ecology, the ecosystem ecology, chapter 42 material that is in your reading guide. All right, so we did talk in the previous video about the trophic levels. So you know how energy can be passed, and matter can be passed from one trophic level to the next trophic level, from, say, the primary producers to the primary consumers to the secondary consumers and so on. So as that's passing, you're passing on, as I said, matter and energy. Energy flows through the system, though. It never gets recycled. On the other hand, the matter, the things, the molecules that make up those living things, including their nutrients, things like carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen, those types of things, they cycle. So matter cannot be created or destroyed. So keep that in mind, that nutrients are going to cycle within a system, and that's why we have things like the carbon cycle that can be diagrammed out. But energy, it flows through. Energy is released from the system with each step because of cellular respiration not being 100% efficient. So not as much energy is available as you move up the trophic levels. If we take a look at the way the energy is utilized by an organism, it's only about 10% of that energy is going to be available for the next trophic level. So this is roughly in the right ballpark for what we're dealing with here. You have this caterpillar eating plant matter. So if a bird came along and ate that caterpillar, how much of the energy from the plant matter would it be able to get? Well, the caterpillar is doing its own cellular respiration, and as it does that, it's releasing energy in the form of heat. So some of that energy that was in the plant matter is being lost from the system at that point, and so that would not be available to the bird. And then in addition to that, some of the plant matter that the caterpillar is eating is unavailable for the next trophic level because it just passes through the organism. The organism's unable to digest that thing. So it's only about, and I know this isn't an exact number here, but the rule of tens is what we're dealing with here. Only about 10% of the energy that was in the caterpillar would be available for the bird at the next level. And this is a diagram that shows that 10% rule being passed up through each of the different trophic levels. So for every 10,000 joules, that's an energy unit of energy that's available at the primary producers, you only get 10 joules of energy available at the tertiary consumer level. So that's why your trophic levels in a food chain would tend to only have at maximum about 5 links. By the time you get to something that's eating the snake, maybe a hawk or something like that, you're only able to get 10 joules of energy in the form of the snake picked up by that next trophic level. And if that trophic level, like say the hawk, was going to be eaten by an even larger predator, which there really isn't anything, there would only be 1 joule of energy available then. So the rule of tens in the energy pyramid are going to limit the number of links in a food chain. So the rule of tens works for the energy pyramid, but it also works for a couple of other relationships as well. So biomass, if you took a look at the amount of biomass, which is the dry weight of the organisms at each of the different trophic levels, that rule of tens tends to fit with that as well, that you have 10 times the biomass at the producer level than you do at the primary consumer level, and 10 times the biomass at the primary consumer level than at the secondary consumer level. It fits similarly to a rule of numbers, that you tend to have 10 times the number of, say, secondary consumers than you do tertiary consumers as well. So rule of tens fits in many of these pyramids in ecology, where you're looking at trophic levels and energy flow and matter flow. Matter gets cycled, but matter being passed from one to the next. Okay, so taking a look at primary producers. Primary producers are going to be the things that are doing photosynthesis typically. So in terrestrial systems, it's definitely going to be things that are plants that are going to be your primary producers. In aquatic ecosystems, your primary producers are going to be algae, and then bacteria, which would be the blue-green algae. Those are the things that are going to be the able to take the carbon dioxide from the air and fix it into organic matter, and that's why we're calling them the producers, because then they can provide that raw material for the next trophic levels above that. Remember though, deep sea floor, remember you had the hydrothermal vents down there, that there was some cheme autotrophic bacteria down there as well. So keep in mind that ecosystem is a little bit different, but you still have producers at the base of the food chain. Okay, So looking at the primary producers and the level of like how fast are they taking carbon dioxide from the air and fixing it into organic molecules such as sugars, that is called primary productivity. So the primary productivity then is it's basically the energy budget of an ecosystem. It's the input, it's the amount of energy that then is available for trophic levels above that. So if you have an ecosystem that has very high level of primary productivity, you may be able to support more trophic levels than one that has less primary productivity, then only fewer trophic levels may be present. Your food chains would be shorter. So primary productivity, I've already verbally defined. It's the amount of energy, light energy, that's converted into chemical energy by the producers. It's basically how much photosynthesis is happening. But we can break this down into GPP, which would be the total primary productivity. That's gross primary productivity is GPP. On the other hand, you could also have net primary productivity, which would be NPP. NPP would take away or subtract from the GPP the amount of energy that is being used by the plants in their own cellular respiration. And so NPP is ultimately what's then available for the trophic levels above it. So it's kind of a more useful measure of what is going to then be able to be passed on to the next trophic levels. So NPP results from the photosynthetic yield minus whatever is used for respiration. Net primary productivity is more useful than GPP because it measures how much energy is available to the consumers. Okay? You've taken away the amount of energy that was utilized in the respiration of the plant itself, so how much is left over is going to be more important for that system. Biomass, I've already defined, is the dry weight of organic material. Another way to think about primary productivity, because you're measuring the amount of photosynthesis, what do they do when they're doing photosynthesis is they're building new molecules, and so they're building new biomass. So another way to measure it would be measuring the rate at which they synthesize new mass, okay, new biomass. This is just a schematic that shows the inputs and what ends up happening to energy transfer and things like that. So you've got your photosynthetic plants getting the energy from the sun. Herbivores are consuming that, but you can also see in yellow off to the side there with each one of these trophic levels, every single trophic level, you're losing some of the energy in cellular respiration, and that heat then is unavailable for future energy transfers. That's released from the system, and so that's why we say energy flows through the system. It is not recycled. Something interesting about primary productivity on the planet is you can take a look at this. This is kind of an interesting graph. Take a look at this. Give it a little bit of a study. There's a few things in here that are quite interesting. You can see over in the first panel the percentage of the Earth's surface area, and then in the second panel it's showing the average net primary productivity per amount of space. And so in that one, your tropical rainforest is very, very high, and the reefs also have a lot of primary productivity on them. The colors have to do with whether they're terrestrial or aquatic systems, so the brown is terrestrial and blue is aquatic. So those two areas, like per amount of space, have the highest amount of primary productivity on the planet. But the bar over in the third panel, which is the percentage of the Earth's final net primary productivity, the bar there that's the highest is actually the open ocean. Even though the open ocean, per amount of area, has very little net primary productivity, it's because of this very high number here for the amount of the Earth's surface area that particular ecosystem covers. So that's why, although it's not like per amount of space very high in primary productivity, there's just so much of it that it ends up being it ends up being the overall as a system the area with the most primary productivity. Second to that would once again be the tropical rainforest. And so this is a very, very important ecosystem as far as harnessing energy from the sun and converting it over into useful energy for many trophic levels above it. And it's one of the reasons why you get so much biodiversity in tropical rainforest areas. In fact, if we take a look at the next slide, you can see the amount of primary productivity here that we, as you move from the equators or from the poles towards the equator, you end up increasing the amount of primary productivity as you go to these areas. So that here's your Amazon rainforest here. You get places, here's sub-Saharan Africa, that's rainforest there as well. You get rainforest in Indonesia. So those places are going to have huge amounts of primary productivity. And because of that, those are also the places that have the highest level of biodiversity on the planet, because the base of that energy pyramid is so broad that you can support a lot of trophic levels above it. And that's just one of the reasons. Other reasons include things like you have a lot of ectotherms, the cold-blooded type organisms. They can do very well in those places as well, whereas they wouldn't survive well in polar regions. So there's several reasons, but that's a main one. The primary productivity piece is a main reason why there's so much biodiversity in those areas. All right, so thinking about primary productivity, the limiting factors for primary productivity are different in terrestrial zones and compared to aquatic zones. In a terrestrial zone, the things that are going to limit the amount of primary productivity in the area would be temperature. Like in the winter time here in Wisconsin, we do not have very much primary productivity happening. It's just too cold, and so that shortens our overall, all of that time down in the equator, that entire period of time where we're shut down and dormant up here. Down there, they're able to continue to do their photosynthesis. So temperature is definitely limiting. Amount of water can be limiting. The amount of primary productivity in a desert region is much lower than it is in an area that has ample water for the plants. And we compare that to things that limit primary productivity in aquatic systems. It largely has to do with light penetration. So if you have clear lakes, then light can penetrate further down, and you can have things that rely on the light, plant-type organisms, even at greater depths than if your lake is very turbid, the water is it's not clear. So light is important. In addition to that, presence of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus can be a limiting thing in aquatic systems, and that's why if you have a lot of, say, phosphorus or nitrogen pollution that you can get in runoff, that some of these lakes can have too much growth of things like some harmful plants and algae and duckweed and things like that that can cause problems that you guys are going to be working on in the POGIL at the end of the packet. All right, so the image that shows an aquatic system. All right, so this is kind of a completely different idea. Let me just see if I want to finish up that idea. Okay, it's the last slide anyway, so let's just, one more idea to mention on here. Go back to the wrong slides. Okay, biomagnification. The last thing to mention on here, and it does have to do with trophic levels and passing matter from one to the next, but it doesn't really have to do so much with energy flow. So I don't know, this is just kind of a little add-on additional thing. Bioaccumulation, though, is when you end up concentrating toxins in the tissues of your higher predators, because if we think about what's happening here, this is for DDT. DDT bioaccumulates, mercury also bioaccumulates. So when you think of bioaccumulation, think of both mercury and DDT. So if that type of pollution ends up in the waterways, then the zooplankton can end up with some of that DDT in their systems. Okay, so each one of these zooplankton, that's a little copepod, here's a little daphnia, they're going to have a dose of DDT in their system. So they've got that labeled here as 0.04 parts per million. Now the small fish eat them. And the thing about things that bioaccumulate is they cannot be eliminated. So they're not given off in waste, in feces or in urine. Instead, they just accumulate in the tissues. So no elimination of them. So once you consume this material, it's in your body for the rest of your life. So the thing about the fish is they're not just eating one of these zooplankton, they're eating a whole bunch of them. And every one of those are going to have a dose of DDT for them. And so they accumulate a higher level in their system than what we had in the zooplankton. And then you just move up the food chain and repeat that. large fish eat more than one small fish, so for each small fish, they're getting a dose of DDT that accumulates then in the system, and then finally you get to the, in this image here, it looks like it's some kind of a fish-eating bird, an eagle or something like that. So what we saw with DDT, and a problem that was related to DDT, was that the eggshells on the raptors, the predatory birds, were getting really, really thin because of DDT, which is a chemical pesticide that is now banned in the United States because of the problems that it was causing. So these birds, their shells would get really, really thin, and then they would have a horrible hatch rate. So when I was a kid, seeing an eagle was like a huge deal, and they were on the endangered species list. It was something that you just never saw. And now, since they've banned DDT, that population has rebounded very, very well and has been delisted. Well, I think it was the first thing that was ever delisted from the endangered species list. Usually they don't go that way. Usually things on the endangered species list are in trouble and stay in trouble. But because of that change that was made in the United States to banning DDT, those populations did rebound. Okay, that would be the end of the ecology unit. Let me know if you have any questions.